If money could solve every problem, why was the only woman who refused it standing in a waitress uniform? The grand ballroom of the Lexington House overlooked the glowing skyline of Manhattan, where the city's tallest buildings reflected against the Hudson River like polished glass beneath the evening sky. Crystal chandeliers shimmered above perfectly arranged dining tables dressed in white linen, while business leaders, investors, philanthropists, and public officials gathered for one of New York City's most prestigious charity galas. Every guest in the room had arrived wearing tailored suits, elegant evening gowns, and confident smiles, each representing organizations capable of moving millions of dollars with a single signature. At precisely 7 o'clock, a convoy of black luxury sedans stopped outside the entrance. Conversations softened almost immediately as Daniel Carter stepped through the revolving doors. At 43 years old, the white billionaire CEO of Carter Capital Holdings had built a reputation for transforming struggling companies into thriving empires. Financial magazines celebrated his instincts. Television interviews praised his discipline. Young entrepreneurs studied his speeches. Yet those who worked closest to him knew another truth. Daniel believed nearly every obstacle in life could be solved with enough resources, enough influence, or enough money. He greeted donors with firm handshakes before making his way toward the private dining section reserved for keynote guests. Servers moved gracefully between tables, balancing silver trays with practiced precision. Among them was Naomi Brooks, a 30-year-old black waitress wearing a spotless black uniform with a neatly pressed black apron. She welcomed every guest with the same calm professionalism, never rushing, never drawing attention to herself. Her warm smile was genuine, her posture confident, and her voice carried quiet respect rather than rehearsed hospitality. She had worked countless events like this one, serving people whose watches often cost more than her annual salary. Yet she never measured herself against the wealth surrounding her. She simply believed every person deserved dignity, including herself. As Daniel approached his reserved table, Naomi stepped forward carrying a bottle of sparkling water and greeted him with a courteous smile. "Good evening, sir." "Welcome." Daniel barely glanced at her before reaching inside his jacket. Without asking her name or exchanging another word, he removed a thick, white envelope and placed it gently on the polished table between them. Several nearby executives noticed immediately. One of them smiled knowingly, assuming Daniel was displaying another act of famous generosity. "There is $5,000 inside," Daniel said casually, "for your excellent service tonight. I appreciate hardworking people." The surrounding guests exchanged impressed looks. $5,000 was more than many people earned in weeks. Some quietly nodded in admiration, believing they had just witnessed extraordinary kindness. Naomi looked down at the unopened envelope for only a moment before lifting her eyes to meet his. There was no excitement, no disbelief, and no hesitation in her expression. Instead, she carefully placed both hands around the envelope, slid it back across the table toward Daniel, and spoke with remarkable gentleness. "Thank you, sir," she said, "but I cannot accept this." The conversation at neighboring tables seemed to disappear into sudden silence. Even the musicians performing soft jazz near the stage felt distant for a heartbeat. Daniel looked at the envelope as though someone had returned a language he no longer understood. No one had ever refused his generosity so calmly. An executive standing nearby laughed quietly under his breath. "She has to be joking," he whispered. Another guest shook his head. "Nobody turns down $5,000. Naomi remained composed, her hands folded neatly in front of her black apron, waiting respectfully for Daniel's response. She offered no explanation and showed no trace of regret. For the first time in many years, the billionaire found himself staring not at someone asking for more, but at someone quietly refusing everything he believed people wanted most. And before the first course of dinner had even been served, the envelope sitting untouched between them had already become the most valuable object in the room. Daniel Carter did not immediately reach for the envelope. Instead, he looked at Naomi Brooks with the quiet curiosity of a man encountering something he had never expected to exist. Throughout his career, investors had accepted impossible offers, competitors had changed their positions for the right price, and entire companies had altered their futures because of enough money placed on the table. Yet the woman standing before him had gently returned $5,000 without asking a single question. Around the ballroom, whispers began spreading faster than the waitstaff carrying the first course. One executive leaned toward another and chuckled. She must not realize how much money that is. Another guest smiled with disbelief. Give her 5 minutes. She will come back. Several donors nodded in agreement, convinced that pride eventually surrendered to reality. Daniel remained silent, studying Naomi's face. There was no sign of nervousness. She had not looked offended. She had not appeared frightened. Most surprising of all, she had not seemed tempted. She simply excused herself with another polite smile and continued serving the surrounding tables exactly as though nothing unusual had happened. She poured sparkling water for an elderly couple, adjusted a chair for a guest using a walking cane, and quietly replaced a misplaced napkin before anyone noticed. Her attention never drifted back toward the unopened envelope resting beside Daniel's dinner plate. The orchestra resumed its soft performance, while conversations gradually returned throughout the ballroom. But Daniel found himself paying less attention to the keynote speakers and more attention to the waitress who had become the evening's unexpected mystery. Every few minutes he caught himself watching her move confidently through the crowded room. She treated the wealthiest donors exactly as she treated the newest volunteers. Every guest received the same warm smile, the same patience, and the same quiet respect. There was no performance in her kindness. It seemed simply to be who she was. Across the table, Daniel's longtime business partner, Richard Ellis, noticed his distraction. You are still thinking about the waitress, Richard said with a grin. Daniel answered honestly. I'm trying to understand her. Richard laughed softly. There is nothing to understand. Some people enjoy making a statement. Daniel glanced toward Naomi again. That did not feel like a performance. Richard shrugged. Then offer her more. The suggestion sounded reasonable. After all, increasing an offer had solved countless negotiations throughout Daniel's career. A few minutes later, Naomi approached once more to serve the first course. Daniel looked up before she could place the plate in front of him. Miss, he began. Brooks, she replied gently. Naomi Brooks. Daniel nodded. Miss Brooks, perhaps you misunderstood. That envelope was not payment for one evening. Think of it as appreciation. If the amount was not appropriate, I can certainly make it 10,000. Several nearby guests paused again, pretending not to listen while hearing every word. Naomi carefully placed the dinner plate before him before answering. Her voice remained calm, respectful, and remarkably steady. Thank you for your generosity, Mr. Carter. The amount is not the reason. Daniel leaned back slightly. Then help me understand. Naomi offered the same composed smile she had worn since the evening began. I appreciate the offer. I truly do. But I still cannot accept it. She gave no further explanation. No dramatic speech. No accusation. No attempt to embarrass him in front of the room. She simply continued serving the remaining guests with graceful professionalism before disappearing once again among the dining tables. Daniel watched her walk away, realizing that for the second time that evening, she had left him with something far more valuable than an answer. She had left him with a question that money could not buy. As the evening continued, the applause following the keynote speech echoed softly through the ballroom, but Daniel Carter barely noticed. His attention kept returning to Naomi Brooks, whose quiet refusal had unsettled him in a way that no difficult negotiation ever had. Around him, conversations drifted back toward investment strategies, charitable pledges, and economic forecasts. Yet the unopened envelope remained untouched beside his dinner plate, like a question no one else seemed interested in answering. Naomi moved gracefully between tables, carrying silver trays with practiced confidence, thanking every guest with the same genuine smile regardless of the size of their donation or the title printed on their business card. She never looked toward Daniel's table unless she was serving it, and she never appeared distracted by the unusual attention she had received. To everyone else, she was simply doing her job. To Daniel, she had become the only person in the room who had challenged something he had believed his entire life. Several tables away, another waitress quietly approached Naomi while arranging dessert forks. Are you sure about what you did? She whispered. That was more money than most people see in months. Naomi smiled gently, without slowing her work. I know. Then why refuse it? The younger waitress asked. Naomi paused only long enough to straighten a linen napkin before answering. Because some things become expensive after you accept them. The younger waitress looked confused, but Naomi simply returned to serving guests before another question could be asked. Those words lingered with her coworker, even if she did not fully understand them. They also reflected a promise Naomi had carried for years. Long before she ever worked inside elegant restaurants, she had learned that money sometimes arrived carrying invisible expectations. She remembered being 16 years old, sitting beside her father in a small legal office after a workplace accident had permanently changed his ability to walk. A company representative had placed a generous settlement offer on the table with one condition. Her father would sign documents preventing him from speaking publicly about ignored safety concerns that had injured several employees. Naomi could still remember her father's tired face as he slowly pushed the paperwork away. "If I sell the truth today," he had told her afterward, "I will spend the rest of my life wondering what I actually kept." They struggled financially after that decision. Medical bills accumulated. Naomi worked part-time through college before eventually leaving school to care for him when his condition worsened. Their apartment was modest. Every paycheck required careful planning. There were birthdays without presents, holidays without vacations, and evenings when they stretched simple meals into enough portions for another day. Yet her father never complained. He often reminded her that hardship could test character, but it never had the authority to define it. "Money should reward honest work," he would tell her. "It should never purchase your self-respect." Those words quietly shaped every choice Naomi made as an adult. She accepted overtime. She accepted difficult customers. She accepted exhaustion. But she never accepted anything that felt like payment for her dignity. Back inside the ballroom, dessert was served as laughter gradually filled the room again. Daniel noticed Naomi helping an elderly volunteer carefully carry several donation boxes toward the lobby after her assigned section had already been completed. No supervisor had asked her to help. No guest appeared to notice. She simply saw someone struggling and offered assistance without expecting recognition. Daniel watched silently, beginning to realize that the answer he was searching for might have very little to do with the envelope and everything to do with the woman who had quietly returned it. The final course had been cleared from the tables, but the conversations throughout the ballroom continued as guests lingered over coffee, discussing charitable initiatives and future investments. Waitstaff moved quietly between the remaining tables, collecting crystal glasses and folded linens with practiced efficiency. Naomi Brooks continued working with the same calm rhythm she had maintained since the evening began, never allowing the unexpected encounter with Daniel Carter to interrupt her professionalism. She thanked every departing guest with genuine warmth, held doors open for elderly donors, and stopped to help a volunteer retrieve a stack of fundraising brochures that had slipped onto the polished marble floor. None of those small acts drew applause. They simply reflected the person she had chosen to become. Daniel watched from across the room with growing uncertainty. Earlier that evening, he had believed he understood generosity. Now he was no longer certain he understood respect. The unopened envelope still rested beside his place setting, untouched by either of them. Richard Ellis noticed Daniel's thoughtful expression and leaned closer. "You are letting this bother you far more than it should," he said. She refused a gift. "It happens." Daniel slowly shook his head. "No. People refuse offers because they want better ones." She refused without trying to negotiate. Richard smiled confidently. "Then perhaps she enjoys making wealthy people uncomfortable." Daniel looked toward Naomi again. She was laughing softly with an elderly volunteer who appeared grateful simply to have someone patiently listening. There was nothing theatrical about her kindness. She was exactly the same with everyone she encountered. "I do not think this is about me," Daniel replied quietly. "I think it is about something she believes." Those words surprised even him. Throughout his career, he had measured people by ambition, performance, and results. Tonight, he found himself measuring someone by principles instead. As more guests departed, the ballroom gradually became quieter. Daniel stood from his chair, picked up the unopened envelope, and walked toward the service station where Naomi was organizing polished silver trays before the evening ended. She noticed him approaching and greeted him with the same respectful smile she had offered every guest all night. There was no awkwardness in her expression, no resentment, and no expectation. "Miss Brooks," Daniel said gently, "may I speak with you for just a moment?" "Of course, Mr. Carter." She stepped aside into a quieter corner near the tall windows overlooking the lights of Manhattan. Outside, traffic flowed steadily through the city while reflections shimmered across the glass. Daniel held the envelope in one hand, but did not offer it again. This time his voice carried curiosity instead of confidence. I have spent my life believing generosity should always be welcomed, he admitted. Tonight you made me realize I might not understand generosity as well as I thought. Naomi remained silent, giving him space to continue. You said the amount was not the reason, Daniel said. Then what is? She looked out toward the city for a brief moment before answering. May I ask you something first? Daniel nodded. Certainly. Naomi turned back toward him. When you placed that envelope on the table, did you know my name? Daniel hesitated. He remembered calling her Miss Brooks only after she introduced herself. No, he answered honestly. Did you know anything about my life? She asked. No. Did you know whether I needed help? Or what kind of help I might actually need? Daniel lowered his eyes for a moment before quietly answering. No. Naomi's expression remained kind. There was no accusation in her voice, only quiet sincerity. Then perhaps you were not offering kindness to me, she said softly. Perhaps you were offering kindness to the idea of me. Daniel stood completely still. For the first time that evening, he realized that his greatest assumption had not been about money. It had been about the woman standing in front of him. And something told him that her next words were about to change far more than a single conversation. Daniel Carter did not answer immediately. The noise of the ballroom faded into the background as Naomi Brooks' quiet question settled between them with unexpected weight. He had built companies by making decisions in seconds, yet now even the simplest response demanded honesty. After a long silence, he looked back at her and said, You are right. I knew nothing about you. Naomi nodded gently. Most people do not. They see the uniform before they see the person. Her words carried neither bitterness nor resentment. They sounded like someone describing the weather, a truth she had accepted long ago without allowing it to harden her heart. Daniel folded the unopened envelope and slipped it back inside his jacket. For the first time that evening, he no longer felt the need to convince her to accept it. Instead, he wanted to understand the life that had shaped such quiet conviction. Would you tell me why? He asked. Not because I want to change your mind. Because I think mine is beginning to change. Naomi studied his face for a moment. She had served thousands of wealthy guests over the years. Many apologized only after they realized they had been watched. Others became curious simply because someone challenged their expectations. But something in Daniel's expression felt different. The certainty that had surrounded him earlier had softened into genuine humility. She took a slow breath before speaking. When I was growing up, she began, my father taught me that respect should always arrive before money. If it arrives afterward, you have to ask yourself what the money is trying to fix. Daniel listened without interrupting. After his accident, people came to our home with offers. They called them generous. They called them fair. But every offer came with something unspoken. Stay quiet. Stop asking questions. Accept this, and everyone can move on. She looked briefly toward the city lights beyond the window. My father always refused. Not because we did not need the money. We desperately needed it. He refused because he believed that accepting money should never require giving away your voice. Daniel remembered the confidence with which he had placed the envelope on the table only hours earlier. At the time, he had believed he was recognizing hard work. Now he realized he had never paused to ask Naomi what recognition actually meant to her. She continued softly. Please do not misunderstand me, Mr. Carter. There is nothing wrong with generosity. I have seen incredible kindness from strangers. But kindness begins with seeing someone as a human being, not as a problem waiting to be solved. Those words landed more heavily than any criticism ever could. Daniel had donated millions to hospitals, scholarship programs, and disaster relief organizations. He genuinely believed in helping people. Yet he suddenly recognized how often he had assumed he already understood what others needed without first taking the time to know them. Naomi smiled warmly, hoping he understood she was not rejecting him as a person. If you had simply introduced yourself, learned my name, and thanked me for my work, I would have remembered that conversation for years. The envelope was generous, but respect would have meant even more. Daniel felt an unfamiliar mixture of admiration and regret. No board meeting had ever taught him this lesson. No business school had ever explained it. Standing before him was a waitress who possessed no corner office, no famous title, and no billion-dollar portfolio. Yet she had quietly revealed a truth that challenged the foundation of how he believed influence should work. Looking at Naomi with newfound respect, he finally understood that some people could enrich your life without accepting a single dollar from your hand. Daniel Carter remained silent long after Naomi Brooks finished speaking. The city lights beyond the ballroom windows reflected across the polished floor, but for the first time in years he was not thinking about tomorrow's meetings, the next acquisition, or the headlines that would follow another successful quarter. He was thinking about a simple truth that should have been obvious all along. He had offered money before offering respect. Slowly, he extended his hand, not with another envelope, not with another proposal, but with genuine humility. "Naomi," he said quietly, speaking her first name for the very first time, "I owe you an apology." She looked at him with calm curiosity. "You came here tonight to do your job," Daniel continued. "I walked in believing I could recognize your value before I even knew who you were. I thought I was being generous. Looking back, I realize I never gave you the chance to simply be yourself." Naomi accepted his words with a gentle smile. "Thank you for saying that." There was no triumph in her expression, no satisfaction from proving a billionaire wrong. She accepted the apology with the same grace she had shown throughout the evening because she had never wanted Daniel to feel embarrassed. She had only hoped he might understand. "May I tell you something else?" she asked softly. Daniel nodded. "Please." "Respect changes both people," Naomi said. "The person receiving it feels seen. The person giving it begins to see differently." Daniel lowered his eyes for a brief moment, allowing those words to settle. He had spent decades leading thousands of employees, believing leadership was measured by vision, discipline, and results. Tonight, a waitress had quietly introduced him to another measure entirely. Leadership also required seeing people beyond their titles, uniforms, or circumstances. Before either of them could continue, the event manager approached Naomi with a warm smile. "We are almost finished here. Thank you for staying late to help with cleanup." Naomi immediately nodded. "Of course." She excused herself and returned to work without hesitation. Daniel watched as she joined the remaining staff. Although her official shift had nearly ended, she helped stack chairs, gathered table settings, and carried boxes of unused supplies toward the storage area. No cameras remained in the ballroom. Most influential guests had already departed. There was no audience left to impress. Yet Naomi worked with the same quiet dedication she had shown all evening. Daniel found himself noticing details he would once have overlooked. She thanked the dishwasher collecting trays. She wished the security guard a safe night before he left his post. She complimented a young server who had successfully completed his first formal event. Every interaction carried sincere respect. It became clear that Naomi did not reserve kindness for important people. She believed every person deserved it equally. Richard Ellis walked over as Daniel continued watching from across the room. "Are you finally ready to leave?" he asked. Daniel answered without taking his eyes off Naomi. "In a minute." Richard followed his gaze and smiled knowingly. "You still cannot figure her out." Daniel shook his head slowly. "No, I think I finally can." Richard raised an eyebrow. Daniel continued quietly, almost speaking to himself. "She never rejected generosity. She rejected being judged before she was known." Those words stayed with him as the ballroom lights gradually dimmed and the last guests disappeared into the Manhattan night. Daniel slipped the unopened envelope deeper into his jacket, realizing it no longer belonged to Naomi. It belonged to the version of himself he was beginning to leave behind. And as he stepped toward the exit, one unexpected thought refused to leave his mind. If a woman with such integrity could teach him this much in a single evening, what else had he been overlooking in the people he passed every day without truly seeing? The following morning, Daniel Carter arrived at the headquarters of Carter Capital Holdings before sunrise, something he had not done in months. The glass tower overlooking Midtown Manhattan slowly filled with employees carrying coffee cups and laptop bags, but Daniel remained alone inside his office, standing beside the floor-to-ceiling windows instead of reviewing financial reports. The unopened envelope rested on his desk, untouched since the previous evening. It no longer represented generosity in his mind. It had become a reminder that assumptions, even well-intentioned ones, could prevent a person from seeing someone clearly. As the city awakened below, Daniel pressed the intercom. "Emily, could you come in for a moment?" His executive assistant entered carrying the day's schedule. "Good morning, Mr. Carter." Daniel looked at her thoughtfully before speaking. "I need a favor, but I want it handled carefully." Emily waited patiently. "Last night, I met a waitress named Naomi Brooks at the Lexington house." Emily smiled politely. "The charity gala?" "Yes." Daniel nodded. "I do not want anyone offering her money, gifts, or special treatment. I only want to know who she is professionally. Education, work history, experience, volunteer activities. Nothing invasive. If she has accomplished something, I want to know because she earned it." Emily looked slightly surprised but simply answered, "I understand." By late afternoon, a small folder rested on Daniel's desk. He opened it expecting a brief employment record. Instead, he found a story that quietly challenged every assumption he had carried into the ballroom. Naomi Brooks had studied business administration at a respected New York university before leaving during her senior year to care for her father after his health declined. Her professors had written recommendations describing her as one of the strongest analytical students in her class. Former internship supervisors praised her leadership, attention to detail, and remarkable ability to solve complex problems under pressure. She had also volunteered on weekends, teaching financial literacy workshops at a neighborhood community center, helping young adults understand budgeting, credit scores, and responsible financial planning. Daniel continued reading in complete silence. There were no awards seeking public attention, no interviews, no attempts to build a personal brand. Every achievement reflected quiet consistency rather than recognition. Emily returned later that afternoon. "Was there anything else you needed?" Daniel slowly closed the folder. "Yes." He looked at her with unusual certainty. "Please arrange an interview." Emily looked confused. "For which position?" Daniel answered immediately. "Not because I met her. Not because I feel guilty. Find an opening where her qualifications genuinely match the role. Then invite her through the same hiring process every other candidate completes." Emily smiled slightly. "You want her to earn it?" Daniel nodded. "Exactly. If she accepts anything from this company, I want it to be an opportunity, not a favor." Across the city, Naomi finished another busy lunch shift without knowing her conversation had continued shaping someone else's decisions. She returned home to the modest apartment she shared with her father, prepared dinner, reviewed medical paperwork, and spent part of the evening helping him organize old family photographs. Her life continued exactly as it had the day before because she had never expected anything in return for speaking honestly. She believed that doing the right thing rarely produced immediate rewards. Sometimes the greatest impact happened quietly, beyond your sight. As Daniel looked once more at Naomi's resume, he realized that true talent often remained invisible because the world spent too much time noticing titles instead of character. This time, he was determined not to make the same mistake twice. 1 week later, Naomi Brooks received an email inviting her to interview for a financial analyst position at Carter Capital Holdings. She read the message twice before quietly setting her phone on the kitchen table. Her father looked up from the crossword puzzle resting on his lap and smiled. "Good news." Naomi handed him the phone without saying a word. He adjusted his reading glasses, finished the message, and looked back at her with gentle pride. "You earned this interview years ago," he said. Naomi smiled, but remained thoughtful. "I hope they are inviting my resume, not my story." Her father nodded. "Then go there and let them meet the same woman who has been sitting in this apartment every evening." 3 days later, Naomi walked through the revolving doors of Carter Capital Holdings wearing a simple navy business suit she had carefully preserved since college. She carried a leather portfolio that had seen better days, but had been maintained with the same care she gave everything she owned. The reception area overlooked Midtown Manhattan through towering windows, where dozens of professionals moved confidently across polished marble floors. No one recognized her as the waitress from the charity gala. To everyone there, she was simply another candidate hoping to earn an opportunity. Daniel Carter watched discreetly from an upper floor after reviewing the interview schedule. He had instructed the hiring committee not to mention the gala, not to give Naomi special consideration, and not to reveal that he had personally requested the interview. The process would remain exactly the same for every applicant. If Naomi joined the company, it would happen because her qualifications deserved it. Inside the conference room, Three senior managers greeted her warmly before beginning a series of analytical case studies. They presented financial reports from fictional companies, investment projections, and operational challenges requiring careful judgment rather than memorized answers. Naomi listened attentively before organizing each problem with calm precision. She identified overlooked risks, proposed practical solutions, and explained every recommendation with remarkable clarity. When one executive intentionally challenged her conclusions, she welcomed the disagreement with professionalism instead of defensiveness, carefully supporting her reasoning with evidence while acknowledging alternative perspectives. The interview lasted nearly 2 hours. As Naomi thanked the panel and prepared to leave, one interviewer smiled. "May I ask you one personal question?" Naomi nodded politely. "Of course. You have an impressive academic record and strong analytical skills. Why have you spent the past several years working in restaurants?" Naomi answered without hesitation. "Because my father needed me more than my career did. Responsibilities sometimes change our timeline, but they do not erase our abilities." The room fell silent for a moment before another interviewer quietly wrote a final note across his evaluation form. Later that afternoon, the hiring committee gathered inside the executive conference room. Daniel remained silent while each manager shared an independent assessment. One praised Naomi's communication skills. Another highlighted her ethical decision-making. A third described her as the strongest candidate interviewed that month because she demonstrated both technical ability and emotional intelligence. Daniel never mentioned the gala. He simply listened until every evaluation had been completed. Finally, the committee unanimously recommended extending an offer. Only then did Daniel allow himself a quiet smile. He had not changed the outcome. Naomi had. She had walked into the building carrying nothing except preparation, experience, and integrity, and she had earned the respect of people who knew nothing about the envelope she once refused. As Daniel looked through the conference room window, he realized that true opportunity did not arrive when powerful people opened doors. It arrived when capable people were finally given the chance to walk through them on their own merits. 3 months later, the view from the 42nd floor of Carter Capital Holdings looked exactly the same, but the people inside the building had begun to change. Naomi Brooks now walked through the lobby each morning carrying the same leather portfolio she had brought to her interview, greeting the reception staff, security officers, and custodians. With the same genuine warmth she had once shown every guest inside the Lexington house. Her title had changed, but her character had not. She quickly earned the respect of colleagues because she listened before speaking, prepared before presenting, and never sought recognition for work that belonged to the entire team. During strategy meetings, she analyzed complex financial models with remarkable clarity, often identifying overlooked opportunities that strengthened major investment decisions. When praised, she always redirected attention toward collaboration rather than personal achievement. Daniel Carter noticed something else as well. Departments that rarely communicated with one another began working together more effectively whenever Naomi participated. Her quiet respect for every person created an atmosphere where people felt comfortable contributing ideas regardless of seniority. One afternoon, Daniel invited senior executives into the boardroom for a leadership workshop that had originally been planned as a routine quarterly review. Charts filled the presentation screens, but instead of beginning with financial results, Daniel closed his laptop and looked around the room. "Today I want to talk about the most important lesson I learned this year," he said. Several executives expected another discussion about market conditions or investment strategy. Instead, Daniel reached inside his desk drawer and placed a familiar white envelope on the conference table. It had never been opened. "Months ago," he continued, "I believed generosity began with writing a check. I was wrong." The room became completely silent. Daniel told them about meeting a waitress who had quietly returned an envelope because she valued respect more than assumptions. He never described her as a victim. He never presented himself as the hero. He simply admitted that he had failed to see the person standing in front of him before trying to solve a problem he had imagined. Then he looked toward Naomi, who had no idea he intended to share the story until that very moment. She seemed slightly embarrassed by the attention, but Daniel smiled warmly before continuing. "The greatest investment our company can ever make is not in buildings, technology, or markets. It is in learning to recognize the dignity, ability, and potential that already exist in people before we decide what they need. No one applauded immediately. The silence carried more meaning than applause ever could. Several executives lowered their eyes in thoughtful reflection, remembering moments when they too had judged people by appearances instead of character. After the meeting ended, employees quietly returned to their offices. Naomi stepped onto the elevator carrying a folder of financial reports, just another part of her workday. Daniel watched the elevator doors close before looking once more at the unopened envelope still resting on the conference table. He picked it up, smiled to himself, and placed it inside a frame that would remain on a shelf in his office, not as a symbol of money refused, but as a reminder of wisdom received. Visitors occasionally asked why an empty envelope occupied such an important place in the office of one of the country's most successful business leaders. Daniel always answered with the same quiet smile. Because that is the day I learned that respect should always arrive before generosity. And somewhere across the city, a father who had once chosen integrity over comfort smiled proudly as his daughter continued proving the lesson he had taught her years before. Wealth could change circumstances. Opportunity could change careers. But only character could change hearts. In the end, the woman who refused an envelope gave a billionaire something far more valuable than money could ever buy. She reminded him that every person deserves to be known before they are judged, respected before they are helped, and valued simply because they are human.